On August 6, 1945, a blazing, million-degree fireball suddenly appeared just above the Japanese city of Hiroshima, instantly killing, burning alive, or vaporizing tens of thousands. Firestorms engulfed the city. Shockwaves and winds over 1,000 miles an hour came next, shattering bodies and buildings, hurling men, women, and children through the air. Nearly all structures were destroyed over a mile from ground zero. There were red, burned, and bloated dead bodies piled up high. The corpses with the guts and the eyes popped out. Clouds of dust turned the morning into twilight. And later, black rain fell. This is from American Crime Case number 97, August 6th and 9th, 1945, the nuclear incineration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can find this at the website revcom.us. As the war in Ukraine becomes more and more protracted, the danger of nuclear war increases. And we have discussed here on the RNL show and on revcom.us that President Putin of Russia has put his nuclear forces on high alert and has conducted exercises with these forces. Biden and the U.S.-dominated NATO bloc have thus far, and luckily for humanity, refrained from directly engaging Russian forces so as not to unleash a nuclear war. Yet, the U.S.'s nuclear-armed submarines in the seas close to Russia, and the U.S.-led NATO bloc has nuclear arms throughout Europe that are just minutes away from being able to strike major Russian cities and military targets. More, the U.S. and NATO are arming Ukraine with advanced weaponry, waging economic and political war against Russia, and have recently moved even more troops into NATO countries on the eastern side of NATO, close to Russia.
Troops from the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division on the march in the forests in Poland's Carpathian Mountains.
With all this, the drumbeat from the U.S. media and politicians for the U.S. to escalate its military involvement, particularly by establishing a no-fly zone.
Okay, so they won't stop importing Russian oil, and they won't even have a no-fly zone?
Why rule out the no-fly zone? Why not make Putin think it's possible?
Which would tremendously increase the risk and the likelihood of direct military engagement, raising the risk of nuclear war even more. Headlines and articles appear. Earlier this week in The Atlantic, an article was posted that titled, "What is the likelihood of nuclear war?" After stating that the risk is not as great as it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, of which President Kennedy said in hindsight that the risk of all-out nuclear war was 50-50. The Atlantic article goes on to say that the war in Ukraine poses the potential for mistakes and miscalculations, and this means the risks are high. And what we want to do today on the RNL show is bring to new generations and to remind those who lived through these past periods where the sort of nuclear devastation was ever present, a basic picture of what nuclear war actually is. But first, we want to briefly establish the scientific understanding of what gives rise to wars in this era of imperialism. In 2018, Bob Avakian gave a talk, Why We Need an Actual Revolution and How We Can Really Make Revolution, that begins with 5 fundamental outrages and crimes of this system that cannot be reformed. These we call the 5 stops. These 5 stops reveal the scientific basis for saying that the capitalist imperialist system is the source of all the oppression that humanity faces, that it is built into this system, and therefore, it is impossible to do away with these outrages through reforming this system, and instead, it must be overthrown. One of these stops is titled Wars of Empire, Armies of Occupation, and Crimes Against Humanity. And here is an excerpt of Bob Avakian speaking on this.
But this system of capitalist imperialism is marked by profound divisions between different classes and groups of people within each country, between a small number of capitalist imperialist countries and the countries under the domination of these imperialists, particularly in the Third World, that is, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, and divisions between imperialist countries themselves, whose rivalry has revolved to a significant degree around their contention for control of colonies and people to exploit in the Third World. And when, for a time in the last century, there were socialist countries, first in the Soviet Union and then also in China, there was a conflict between the imperialist powers and those socialist countries which the imperialists worked to isolate, suffocate, and destroy. All this led to 2 world wars in the last century, in which tens of millions of people were killed, including huge numbers of civilians. Since the end of World War II in 1945, the divisions that marked the world within the overall framework of domination by the capitalist imperialist system have led to continual wars. Wars where imperialist powers have unleashed massive violence against people fighting for liberation from imperialism in countries of the Third World, such as the war in Vietnam, where the U.S. slaughtered several million Vietnamese and poisoned much of the soil of that country with chemical weapons. War crimes and crimes against humanity that the U.S. imperialists have continued in all parts of the world, including today, for example, in the Middle Eastern country of Yemen, where because of bombing and other actions by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, backed, armed, and aided by the U.S., 1 million people, including large numbers of children, are suffering and many are dying from the terrible disease cholera. And 8 million people, more than a fourth of the population, are facing starvation. And there are wars between different oppressive forces, including wars where imperialist powers fight each other not directly, but through proxies, such as the war which has devastated Syria over the past several years, where the U.S. and Russia have backed, armed, and aided different factions. While another world war, which especially with the arsenals of nuclear weapons in the hands of the U.S. and Russia, China, and some other countries, could lead to destruction and death on a massive scale, and could even bring about the extinction of the human race. While this has so far been avoided, so long as the capitalist imperialist system continues to dominate the world, and the profound divisions this embodies and enforces continue to exist, the danger remains of a far more devastating war than anything previously endured by humanity. Only through the overthrow of this system, including in its greatest centers of power in the imperialist countries themselves, an overthrow carried out also with the aim of preventing these imperialists from launching an all-out war of annihilation. Only in this way can we advance toward the goal of overcoming the divisions among human beings that embody exploitation and oppression and lead to violent conflict, and finally make a reality of the dreams and aspirations of so many for a world without war.
This provides a scientific foundation for how to understand and what stand to take towards the war in Ukraine. Bob Avakian has written, quote, "Of course, this act of imperialist aggression by Russia deserves to be condemned, but especially for people residing in this country, which again, by far holds the record for such acts of aggression, it is a matter of basic principle and profound importance not to be echoing the positions and serving the aims of our imperialists, and instead to be making very clear our opposition to the aims and actions of these U.S. imperialists who are using opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine not as a way of promoting peace or the right of nations to self-determination, but as a means of furthering U.S. imperialist interests in opposition to the rival Russian imperialists, end quote. So with all this in mind, let's take a look at nuclear war, starting with the fact that the only country that has actually used nuclear weapons is the United States. The president of the U.S., as World War II was drawing to a close, was Harry Truman. For sheer, blood-curdling imperialist bullshit, watch this from Harry Truman.
We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. Having found the atomic bomb, we have used it. We shall continue to use it until we completely destroy Japan's power to make war. Only a Japanese surrender will stop us. It is an awful responsibility which has come to us. We thank God that it has come to us instead of to our enemies. And we pray that He may guide us to use it in His ways and for His purposes.
If you didn't believe me that Hiroshima and 3 days later Nagasaki were not military targets, watch this clip. And this is from a government film that was edited into a feature documentary in 1983 titled Atomic Cafe.
The group had been told to select some targets in Japan that had not been bombed. In other words, they wanted virgin targets. And the reason behind it, even though not given to the group at that time, the reason behind it was that they wanted to be able to make bomb blast studies or bomb damage studies on virgin targets once the bombs were used. And they offered such a, well, you could almost say a classroom experiment as far as being able to determine later the bomb damage.
On RevCom this week, we write, quote, to understand how incredibly dangerous nuclear weapons are, consider this. The single bomb that devastated Hiroshima in 1945, ultimately killing over 140,000 people, had a yield of 15 kilotons. That is the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. As of 2020, 9 countries possess over 12,700 nuclear warheads, over 90% in the hands of US and Russia. The most powerful warhead has a yield of 1.2 megatons. This is the equivalent of 1.2 million tons, 80 times as powerful as the American bomb that incinerated Hiroshima. Again, the United States and Russia together have 8,000 nuclear weapons. Understand that because these bombs are delivered by missiles, the time between launch and explosion is measured in minutes, so that the decision to go to nuclear war is principally in the hands of the US and Russian presidents. But after that, much of these responses are triggered almost automatically. It is very hard to stop a nuclear exchange once it is started. And then even the explosion of a single one of the smallest nuclear weapon would be catastrophic. An article in The Atlantic says that the detonation of a single 1 megaton bomb would, within a 4-mile radius, produce winds equal to those of a Category 5 hurricane, immediately flattening buildings, knocking down power lines, and triggering gas leaks. Anyone within 7 miles of the detonation would suffer third-degree burns, the kinds that sear and blister flesh. There are several projections of what would be the result of a limited nuclear exchange of just 100 such weapons. Now remember, the US and the Russians have 8,000 weapons, so a small exchange might be just 100 weapons. The projections that various groups have made range of deaths from 34 to 90 million people relatively rapidly. And the long-range effect of radiation and climate devastation would dramatically increase that number and possibly even lead to the extinction of humanity. And there are many studies with varying projections, but all of them strain the imagination for the horror that they predict. To give you a more visceral picture of this, in 1983, a film was made for ABC TV titled The Day After. Over 100 million people were glued to their TVs that night as the specter of nuclear war hung over the world as the US and Soviet Union were threatening World War III. The Day After is a fiction film, but there is accuracy to what a strike by nuclear weapons would mean.
They're on their way to Russia. They take about 30 minutes to reach their target.
So do theirs, right?
Missile warning, this is Beale. Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high. Roger, we've got 32 targets in track and 10 impacting points. I want to confirm, is this an exercise? Roger, copy. This is not an exercise.
Come on, baby, don't die on me now. Oh.
That such weapons exist, let alone that they are integrated into the strategic doctrine of contending imperialist governments, is all the indictment that one should need to devote every effort to putting an end to a system that could contemplate, that could engineer, that could develop doctrine, that could threaten and then actually use such monstrous weapons. But there is another way. A concentrated expression of the new communism is this provision in the Constitution for a new socialist republic in North America, written by Boboveki, and it states in Article 1, Part C3, this: the new socialist republic in North America will not develop and will not use nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. It will wage a determined and many-sided struggle to rid the world of all such weapons, and it will do this as part of a larger overall struggle to defeat and dismantle all imperialist and reactionary states and forces to advance toward the achievement of communism throughout the world, which will finally make it possible for the desires and dreams of countless human beings throughout history and the fundamental interests of humanity for a world without war to long last be realized. This is an expression of the bedrock principle of the new communism, that the means of this movement, of this revolution, must flow from and be consistent with the fundamental ends of abolishing all exploitation and oppression through revolution led on a scientific basis.